PANAF ECHO, the African perspective.
African geopolitics. Monthly News Roundup, January 2024. Burkina Faso, Togo. Unsuccessful coup attempt in Burkina Faso. A deep dive into the events that took place around the 14th of January 2024 in Burkina. The Burkinabe authorities foiled a coup attempt allegedly fomented by ousted leader Paul-Henri Damiba, currently exiled in neighboring Togo, as reported by the LDNA, or the African Defense League in English. The destabilizing network is said to comprise of a mixture of active, retired, and exiled soldiers, business moguls, and corrupt civil organizations. They were supposed to create chaos in order to allow for the intervention of suspicious armed groups, which we'll talk about again later, ready to pounce from the south of Burkina and northern Togo. The LDNA also revealed that ousted leader Damiba had discreetly arranged for his family to leave Burkina and join him in Togo only 3 days prior to the coup attempt. Furthermore, renowned businessman Prosper Basile, director of the BOMAF Group, of which we'll speak about again later as well, was arrested right after the failed coup attempt. Togo seems to once again serve as the launching pad of destabilization in the region. As early as the beginning of January, the LDNA had already sounded the alert that there were covert operations in the north of Togo. There were reports of movement of unknown Caucasian military troops and large numbers of containers and construction machines branded UN. All this begs the following questions. What are UN-branded containers and construction machines doing in a country where the UN doesn't have a peacekeeping force? Why were foreign troops secretly on Togolese soil? Some geopolitical analysts suggest that this is linked to the creation of the Alliance of the Sahel States, since the three countries of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger kicked out the NATO security guards, meaning France and the UN, and decided to join their military forces to restore peace and security themselves. Western interests have been in jeopardy. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have been pillaged for centuries and represented a free and seemingly limitless source of every commodity the West needs: gold, petrol, gas, fresh water, uranium, copper, etc. Alongside this pillaging, the West was also able to extract two other key commodities: drugs and human resources. Europe's supply of South American drugs comes through Africa, in its great majority. The drugs are shipped to the west coast of Africa by the South American cartels, and it is then moved through age-old trans-Saharan trade routes, which lead to Europe. The human resources are a byproduct of all this chaos, with poor populations being forced to migrate to Europe to fuel their economy. It is for these reasons and more that NATO has been tasked to militarily control the region. You can see for yourselves the number of foreign bases present just in West Africa and the Sahel region in 2019. But don't just take our word for it. Hear it from the mouth of those who have organized and run it. Former French president concedes France is nothing without Africa. We often forget one thing. It's that a large portion of the money in our wallets comes precisely from the exploitation, for centuries, of Africa. Not solely, but much of it comes from the exploitation of Africa. So, a bit of common sense is needed. Not generosity, but common sense. A sense of justice. To give back to Africans, I would say, what has been taken from them. Especially since it's a necessity if we want to avoid the worst convulsions or difficulties with the political consequences that it entails in the near future. It is within this context that the report of the movement of unknown Caucasian troops and equipment towards northern Togo seems to be in an attempt to prepare something with regards to Burkina Faso. The LDNA claims that these troops had been transported using air services from the BOMAF group mentioned earlier, and that if the destabilizing network had created enough chaos with the coup attempt, which involved the assassination of Ibrahim Traoré, it would have prompted these armed troops stationed in northern Togo to cross into Burkina Faso and try and reach the capital to re-establish one of their puppets in power. The Alliance of Sahel States is putting an end to foreign meddling and military occupation on their soil and has chased the majority of the mining and trafficking experts, posing as soldiers and security personnel, out of their territory. Apart from one last U.S. military base in Niger, which should follow soon. Such is the permanent threat under which the populations of this region has been for decade after decade, resulting in all these countries' populations having to live in abject poverty despite having scandalous amounts of resources under their feet and limitless potential. What this alliance has achieved is already inspiring neighboring countries to do the same and will surely expand further as long as the authorities of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are protected. Benin, the latest guinea pig of the Gulf of Guinea. The WHO continues its mandate of experimental studies on the youth of the Gulf of Guinea on behalf of large Western pharmaceutical companies. After the recent experimental campaigns launched in Cameroon against malaria, and Togo against human papillomavirus, as well as the genetically modified mosquitoes experiments in Burkina Faso of target malaria. Their sight is now set on Benin, where an experimental malaria drug is set to be rolled out. It is in the hands of the populations to denounce these experiments on the African youth. Once again, we're being used as lab rats, or more precisely, as biochemical weapons target practicing. Central African Republic. First it was France, now the population denounces the United States. Central African Republic citizens protested in front of the U.S. Embassy to exhort them to stop meddling into their country's affairs. This comes after reports surfaced about an American private military company called Bancroft approaching the Ministry of Mines and Geology to implement itself in the country and to build a drone base there. Foreign Affairs Minister Sylvie Baipo Teman reveals how the UN decided unilaterally, at the request of the USA, to authorize the implementation of military and communication equipment in the country without even approaching the authorities, further exposing the neo-colonial state of domination under which all African countries still remain.
Une notification a été faite par les États-Unis d'Amérique au sein du Conseil de sécurité de manière à pouvoir déployer en terre centrafricaine des armes, des radiocommunications et autres pour un certain nombre d'opérations dans le cadre des activités qu'ils mènent. Et cela, comme je l'ai dit, j'ai contacté l'ambassade parce que j'ai dénoncé cela, la partie centrafricaine, le gouvernement centrafricain n'avait pas été mis au fait. Donc c'est encore une fois de dire le deux poids deux mesures du Conseil de sécurité. C'est que normalement c'est l'État qui sollicite en fonction de ses besoins. Ce n'est pas les autres États qui décident de ce qu'ils doivent envoyer. Et après on va nous dire que voilà, on envoie des armes, on fait des choses. La République centrafricaine est un État souverain. On doit travailler avec. Il faut accepter de travailler avec elle. En tout cas, quand il faut travailler en terre centrafricaine, il faut accepter de travailler avec elle.
This latest move from the U.S. comes a week after presidential advisor Fidel Guanjica stated that there are plans for the Russian Federation to build a big military base which would easily be able to accommodate 10,000 Russian troops. He also added that if the Russian Federation abandons us now, we'll get eaten up by the Westerners, remembering how the Russian army recently helped the Central African Republic fight back after NATO-backed armed groups had taken over 80% of the territory. NATOWAS is dead. Let us briefly explain why we rebranded ECOWAS into NATOWAS for those that might be shocked by this. In a world where the masks have finally fallen and the post-World War II peace and love bubble has been busted, the critical mass realizes that it's been led on. The conflicts in Ukraine and Palestine have forced people to open their eyes to the fact that only brutal force prevails, as it's always been. Africans that were still unconscious of the fact that they had been pacified and brainwashed to believe that their countries were independent and that demilitarization and democracy are what they need to live in peace are finally hearing the lies for what they were. Most African countries are still under an ever-changing colonial control and are waging a hybrid war to free themselves. In some parts of the continent, the war is invisible, such as in South Africa, Tanzania, Equatorial Guinea, or Rwanda, but the pressure is immense.
You speak to me as if France was still a colonial power, but I do not want to take care of electricity problems in the universities of Burkina Faso. That's his job. That's the job of the president. So on the other hand, I reassure you. Oh, what's this? He's going away. Stay there. Maybe he's off to repair the air conditioning.
In other parts, it is through good old proxy wars and military occupation, using the pretext of insecurity and instability, which they create themselves, to conduct large-scale military operations which have to last as long as possible, so that resources can be extracted. It is for these reasons that we have chosen to single out the real threat to all of Africa's stability: NATO. The West rules over the world through military might, and all their weapons come from NATO, so that is the main threat. It is a war machine that has for mission to create as much chaos as possible around the world, directly or through proxies, to increase weapons sales and secure the supply of critical resources to Western economies. West Africa and the Gulf of Guinea have been controlled by the West uninterruptedly since colonial times. And if one looks at the pictures of the ECOWAS emergency meeting after Niger's popular revolution, it's easy to see why we will now refer to ECOWAS as NATOWAS. Luckily, there are recent events that substantiate our point of view. There was the African neocolonial tour of U.S. Secretary Head of State Anthony Blinken. Here is what he said to the Cape Verdean leader during his first stop. As President Biden has said, we are all in when it comes to Africa. We see Africa as an essential, critical, central part of our future. When an imperialist force is letting you know they're all in and for the long run, it would be wise to listen closely. Interestingly, this tour was scheduled to begin shortly after it was made public that NATO wanted to increase their military presence in West Africa in order to counter the alliance of the Sahel states, most probably to ensure the colonies of NATOWAS comply with the instructions received. On the other hand, there were the revelations of Malian revolutionary leader Assimi Goïta. Could France and the UN be labeled terrorist state and entity? Assimi Goïta reveals how the UN and France help terrorists in the region and makes shocking revelations about Western neo-colonial tactics. Mali already claimed to have gathered substantial evidence proving that France were backing the terrorists, destabilizing the country for over a decade, which we covered in a previous video. Link on screen and in the description.
I spent a year and 4 months on a mission in Sudan and left the country just after its partition into 2 states. Since the announcement that the UN authorized a full deployment of the MINUSMA in Mali, I imagined the Sudanese scenario in our country. Once they're in your country, it will be very difficult for them to leave. Despite France's withdrawal, its presence in Mali persisted through the actions of MINUSMA. It is the great powers that are behind all international missions to ensure their influence and global reach. The decisions made by these great powers often have an impact on other nations, which take them into account for their own military or diplomatic decisions. You witnessed with me that since the announced departure of MINUSMA with the handing over of camps in Mali, we have witnessed sporadic attacks on cities, on the Tombouctou boat, on Bamba and Burum, just to spread fear and doubt among the population. But Malians understood their strategy. They stood behind the authorities. We systematically recovered the camps, city by city, according to the withdrawal schedule. In Argalok, MINUSMA provided equipment to terrorist groups. This transfer was filmed by our drones, and we have the footage. MINUSMA destroyed the entire camp before withdrawing. They followed the same pattern in the camp of Kidal, abandoning the base with our equipment, thus allowing the enemy to take possession. Our goal was clear: to recover the camp of Kidal at all costs. We fought to regain this camp after intense day and night bombings against terrorist armed groups. They fled, Part of what they left behind was 15 MINUSMA armored vehicles in good condition. In Tessalit, they had surrounded the city, and we intercepted their communication indicating not to attack certain individuals considered as allies. The camp was handed over under fire, thinking that we were coming by land. It was our planes that brought our men. Thank God, we succeeded in getting MINUSMA to leave. It didn't meet the expectations of the Malian people.
Now that this has been explained, it should enlighten everyone as to the reasons behind the withdrawal of the countries of the Alliance of the Sahel States, ASS, from NATOWAS. In a short, yet historical, simultaneous broadcast on both Mali and Niger national televisions, Colonel Abdoulaye Maiga, Malian government spokesman and Minister of Territorial Administration, and Colonel Amadou Abdrahman, Niger government spokesman, simultaneously informed the public of the official withdrawal of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger from NATOWAS. The reasons cited for the withdrawal are the failure of the organization to uphold its founding values and its own rules, the fact that it is under Western influence, its refusal to help the three countries when they were fighting an existential battle against terrorism, its eagerness to impose unlawful and inhumane sanctions on their population, and to threaten the use of force when the three countries were forced to take matters into their own hands. This withdrawal amputates NATOWAS of 55% of its territory, of about 20% of its population, and close to 10% of its GDP. The countries of the ASS are landlocked, which has historically forced them to rely on neighboring countries' ports for access to the sea. Very lucrative deals were signed with these neighboring countries in order to enable them to export the vast amounts of resources they produce each year. They'll now fall back on allies such as Guinea or circumstantial economic partners such as Togo and Morocco. The NATOWAS loses a huge market to export to and all the major land and air transport corridors across the Sahara Desert, creating a logistical nightmare for the parties affected. No one can truly predict how long the organization can survive after this secession. One thing for sure is that the winds of change are blowing and that the Pan-African revolutionary movement, which has resurfaced in the Sahel, is bound to spread. With critical elections taking place over the next 2 years in Ghana, Guinea, Senegal, Togo, and Guinea-Bissau, the geopolitical landscape will surely be intriguing.
Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more echoes of current affairs.